Before this story begins, subscribe now, because some truths are too powerful to be ignored, and some stories are meant to change you. They tried to silence my daughter in every way that matters. First with control, then with fear, and finally with violence. Silence is never sudden, it is trained. It begins with small compromises, with a young woman learning to swallow her instincts to keep the peace, to love harder, to believe that patience can heal what respect never existed to begin with. My daughter learned that silence the hard way. She learned it through apologies she didn't owe, through bruises she explained away, through the quiet shrinking of her own voice, so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. By the time they found her body, broken and bleeding, silence had done what fists alone could not. It had almost erased her. But silence does not end a mother. It awakens her. When I stood in that hospital room and watched machines breathe for my child, something inside me split open. The world wanted me to be still, to be grateful she was alive, to accept the official story and move on. But grief doesn't always come as tears. Sometimes it arrives as clarity so sharp it hurts. I realized in that moment that my daughter's silence was not weakness, it was survival. And if survival had been her burden, then speaking would become mine. They told me not to ask questions. They told me I was emotional, that I was looking for someone to blame, that tragedy doesn't always have a villain. But a mother knows the difference between chaos and cruelty. I had raised this girl. I knew the rhythm of her heart, the way her body reacted to fear, the way her eyes changed when danger was near. When I said his name, and her pulse jumped beneath my fingers, I understood something the police never would do. The truth doesn't need words when love is paying attention. I began to hear everything that had been hidden in her silence. Every unfinished sentence. Every forced smile. Every time she chose peace over protection because she believed love required endurance. Society teaches women to endure quietly, to call suffering strength, to mistake tolerance for virtue. That lie almost killed my daughter. And when I saw it clearly, grief stopped being passive. It caught fire. There is a moment when mourning ends and resolve begins. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like a woman sitting alone at her kitchen table at 3 a.m., replaying conversations she once dismissed, realizing they were warnings. It looks like rage wrapped in patience. It looks like a mother deciding that if the world refuses to hear her daughter, she will become loud enough for both of them. I stopped crying in front of people, not because I wasn't broken, but because tears invite dismissal. Instead, I listened. I remembered. I documented. I noticed how quickly people defended him and how slowly they remembered her. I saw how easily a woman's pain is minimized when it complicates a convenient story. My daughter was no longer just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her truth, and I refused to let it be buried under polite lies. They wanted a silent victim. They didn't expect a watchful mother. I learned that silence is often mistaken for peace, but it is actually pressure. And pressure, when ignored, becomes force. Every suppressed truth gains weight. Every lie told to protect power sharpens the blade of accountability. The system had failed my daughter because it had already decided who was believable. But motherhood does something dangerous to fear. It makes it negotiable. I had already imagined losing her. After that, intimidation had no leverage. My daughter lay there unable to speak, and yet she spoke through me, through my questions that wouldn't soften, through my refusal to accept unfortunate as an explanation for brutality, through my steady presence that reminded everyone involved that this story was not over. She had been silenced by hands. I was awakened by love. People underestimate women who grieve quietly. They assume sorrow makes us fragile. They forget that sorrow also makes us precise. I was no longer distracted by comfort or reputation or approval. I was focused. Focused women are dangerous because we stop needing permission. We stop waiting for validation. We stop hoping someone else will do the right thing. My daughter's silence became my language. It taught me how violence hides behind charm, how abuse thrives in disbelief, how truth survives in the smallest reactions. I learned to trust my instincts the way she once had before she was taught not to. In that awakening, I became something I had never planned to be, a witness who would not look away. This is how a daughter silenced awakens a mother. Not with speeches, not with revenge fantasies, but with an unbreakable refusal to let the truth die quietly. When a woman you love is nearly erased, you don't return to who you were before. You evolve. You sharpen. You step into a role history knows well, but society pretends not to fear a mother who will outlast denial. They tried to end my daughter's voice. Instead, they multiplied it. Because silence may weaken a woman for a season, but it creates a mother who will spend the rest of her life making sure the truth is heard. The lie did not arrive loudly. It came dressed as procedure, wrapped in paperwork, spoken calmly by people who believed authority alone could make it real. Lies like that are the most dangerous because they sound reasonable. They said it was unclear. They said there were no witnesses. They said the injuries were consistent with an accident. Each sentence was another shovel of dirt thrown gently, professionally, over the truth while it was still breathing. The lie was not just meant to protect one man, it was meant to preserve comfort, reputation, and the illusion that the system works the same for everyone. It almost worked. Almost. What they tried to bury was not only what happened to my daughter, but who she was. The lie reduced her to a statistic, a case number, a complication. It erased context. It erased pattern. It erased the slow build of fear that had lived in her for months. Lies do that. They simplify suffering until it fits neatly into a file. And once suffering is simplified, it becomes dismissible. That is how truth dies in America, not with denial, but with indifference disguised as order. I watched the lie spread. Family members were encouraged to accept it for the sake of healing. Friends were told not to speculate. Neighbors whispered, unsure what to believe. And every time someone repeated the official version, it grew stronger. Lies gain power when repeated by good people who don't want trouble. They don't require evil to survive, only silence and exhaustion. But lies leave fingerprints. They contradict themselves. They rush conclusions. They resist questions. And this one panicked every time I slowed it down. Every time I asked for clarification, timelines shifted. Every time I asked for documentation, pages were missing. Every time I brought up prior reports, I was told they were all related. Lies hate patience. They rely on urgency, on grief, on the hope that pain will make people compliant. They expected a broken mother. What they got was a woman who refused to move on without answers. The lie nearly buried the truth because it was supported by power. Power that assumes credibility. Power that expects obedience. Power that is rarely challenged by women, especially grieving ones. But power makes one critical mistake. It assumes it will never be questioned by someone who has nothing left to lose. When you have stood at the edge of losing your child, intimidation becomes background noise. I began to see the lie clearly for what it was: a shield. A shield for a man who knew how to look harmless. A shield for institutions that didn't want scrutiny. A shield built on the old, reliable belief that women exaggerate, that emotions distort facts, that domestic violence is messy and therefore inconvenient. The lie didn't just protect him, it depended on cultural laziness. Truth, on the other hand, required work. It required remembering things people wanted forgotten. It required connecting dots no one had bothered to draw. It required confronting uncomfortable realities about how often women are disbelieved unless they die, and sometimes not even then. The truth was heavier than the lie, and that is why they tried to bury it quickly. But truth has one flaw that lies never overcome: it resurfaces. It resurfaces in overlooked messages, in body language, in fear that doesn't match the story, in evidence dismissed too early, and in mothers who refuse to forget. The lie nearly buried the truth, but it underestimated endurance. It underestimated how long a woman can hold onto a single, burning question. It underestimated how impossible it is to erase what love remembers. In the end, the lie collapsed under its own weight. Not because the system suddenly became righteous, but because truth, when protected long enough, becomes undeniable. And once the truth was uncovered, it didn't whisper. It testified. Grief is often portrayed as soft, weeping, fragile. That version makes people comfortable. But real grief, the kind that comes from nearly losing your child, is not gentle. It is volcanic. It rearranges the landscape of your soul. It burns away hesitation, politeness, and fear. It leaves behind something raw and powerful purpose. At first, my grief hollowed me out. I moved through days like a ghost, functioning on instinct, breathing because my body remembered how, even when my heart forgot why. But grief does not stay still. It transforms. And when it does, it becomes dangerous to those who depend on your silence. Somewhere between sleepless nights and unanswered questions, my grief ignited. It stopped asking why and started asking how. How did this happen? How did everyone miss it? How did he think he would get away with it? Fire does not scream immediately. It smolders, it waits. And that was my grief, controlled, focused, patient. I did not lash out. I did not self-destruct. I sharpened. Every tear became fuel. Every memory became evidence. Every wave of sorrow strengthened my resolve. I was no longer driven by pain alone, but by responsibility. My daughter survived, but the truth had not. And if I didn't protect it, no one would. There is a moment when grief stops being about loss and starts being about justice. That moment changes a woman. It makes her immune to manipulation, immune to dismissal, immune to fear. I did not need to be brave, I needed to be relentless. And relentlessness is what grief gives when it has nowhere else to go. People tried to calm me. They told me to focus on healing, to let professionals handle it, to trust the process. But grief teaches you something professionals often forget: systems are made of people, and people avoid inconvenience. My grief did not allow avoidance. It demanded that someone answer for the damage done to my child's body, mind, and future. Fire reveals truth. It exposes weak structures. It burns away false narratives. It forces everything into the light. My grief became that fire. It illuminated inconsistencies. It pressured silence. It made people uncomfortable. And discomfort is where truth begins to move. Those who dismissed me early began to reconsider. Those who ignored me began to listen. Not because I raised my voice, but because I never backed down. A grieving woman who refuses to disappear is terrifying to those who rely on forgetting. I was not violent. I was not reckless. I was worse. I was committed. And commitment outlasts resistance. My grief did not seek revenge in the traditional sense. It sought exposure. It sought consequence. It sought a future where my daughter's suffering would not be reduced to a footnote. Fire does not destroy everything. It forges. It forged me into someone I did not recognize but deeply respected. Someone who could sit across from authority without shrinking. Someone who could hear lies without flinching. Someone who understood that love, when threatened, becomes a force no system is prepared to handle. My daughter watched me change. In her eyes, I saw something return: trust. Trust that she had not suffered alone. Trust that her silence had not been in vain. Trust that what nearly destroyed her would not be allowed to disappear quietly. That is what happens when a woman's grief turns into fire. It stops being about what was taken and becomes about what will never be allowed again. And once that fire is lit, it does not go out. It waits, steady, controlled, eternal, until justice is done. Justice failed my daughter long before it ever looked her in the eyes. It failed her the moment her pain became inconvenient, the moment her fear complicated a clean narrative, the moment her survival demanded effort instead of sympathy. Justice likes victims best when they are quiet, simple, and gone. My daughter was none of those things. She lived, she remembered, she reacted. And for that, justice hesitated. It stalled. It hid behind policy and procedure and professional distance. It asked for patience while doing nothing worthy of it. I watched the failure unfold in slow motion. Reports were delayed, calls went unanswered, promises dissolved into silence. Every step forward required 10 explanations, as if truth needed permission to exist. They spoke to me in rehearsed tones, trained to sound compassionate while offering nothing concrete. I learned quickly that justice does not collapse loudly. It erodes. It wears itself down through avoidance, through underfunding, through the quiet decision to let time solve what courage refuses to confront. They told me the system was overwhelmed. They told me cases like this were complicated. They told me to trust them. What they never said out loud was that my daughter's suffering did not rank high enough to justify disruption. Justice failed because it calculated cost. And my daughter, like so many women, was deemed too expensive. But failure has a consequence they never account for. When institutions retreat, responsibility does not vanish, it transfers. And it transferred to me. A mother does not have the luxury of abstraction. I could not reduce my child to a case file or a statistic. I saw her every day struggling to sleep, flinching at noises, rebuilding herself piece by piece, while the world debated whether her pain was provable enough. Justice had the option to disengage. I did not. That is the difference between duty and love. Duty ends at policy. Love does not end. I refused to accept that justice was a place you go to and hope for the best. I began to understand it as something you demand, something you pressure into existence, something you force into motion, when it would rather remain still. I did not scream or threaten. I persisted. Persistence is what systems fear most, because it exposes their weakest defense: delay. I documented everything. I asked questions until answers had to be invented or revealed. I followed processes they assumed no one had time to follow. I showed up repeatedly, calmly, relentlessly, until my presence became unavoidable. Justice failed because it expected grief to exhaust me. It did not understand that grief, when ignored, hardens into resolve. They underestimated how far a mother will go when her child's life has been altered forever. I was not seeking vengeance in the way movies portray it. I was seeking acknowledgement, accountability, consequence. I wanted someone to say, without hesitation or qualification, that what happened was wrong and that it mattered. Justice could not find the words, so I forced the conversation. I learned that justice is not blind, it is selective. It sees power clearly. It recognizes influence immediately. It hesitates when truth threatens comfort. And when it fails, it hopes those harmed will retreat quietly into survival mode. I refused. I was no longer interested in being polite. Politeness is often the enemy of progress. I became precise instead. Every time they tried to close the door, I opened another one. Every time they suggested I wait, I asked for a reason. Every time they spoke in vague assurances, I asked for dates, names, documentation. Justice does not like specificity when it has failed. Specificity demands action. I was told I was difficult. I was told I was emotional. I was told I was making things harder than they needed to be. What they meant was that I was making it harder for them to remain passive. Justice failed because it hoped resistance would discourage me. What it learned instead was that refusal has stamina. A mother refusing to accept failure is not dramatic. She is methodical. She is patient in ways bureaucracy never anticipates. She understands that time is not neutral, it either protects the guilty or vindicates the truth. I chose to make time work for my daughter. I did not replace justice. I cornered it. I forced it to confront its own negligence. I forced it to reopen questions it wanted buried. I forced it to remember that its purpose was not convenience, but protection. Justice failed, but it did not disappear. It was dragged back into relevance by a woman who would not allow her child to be forgotten. Refusal is powerful because it has no expiration date. I did not need to win quickly. I needed to win correctly. I learned to operate within the system while never trusting it fully. I learned to speak its language without surrendering my truth. Justice failed my daughter once. I refuse to let it fail her again. There is a myth that individuals are powerless against institutions. That myth survives because most people eventually give up. Mothers do not. Not when their children are involved. Not when silence becomes complicity. Not when failure becomes normalized. I refused because refusal was the only moral option left. Justice is not a promise. It is a pressure point, and when pressed by someone who will not let go, it moves. Slowly. Reluctant moves. Justice failed. A mother refused to let that be the ending. Quiet revenge does not announce itself. It does not break windows or raise voices. It does not rush, it watches, it waits. It studies patterns the way predators do, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Loud revenge burns fast and dies young. Quiet revenge survives, it adapts. It learns where power hides and how fear disguises itself as confidence. Quiet revenge is dangerous because it looks like patience, sounds like cooperation, and feels like surrender, until it isn't. They expected anger from me. They expected threats, accusations, public breakdowns. They expected a grieving woman to implode. When none of that came, they relaxed. That was their mistake. Silence made them careless. Calm made them comfortable. They mistook my restraint for weakness, not realizing restraint is often strategy in its purest form. Quiet revenge begins with memory, with a refusal to forget details others dismiss as irrelevant. Dates, times, expressions, changes in behavior, inconsistencies people explain away because it is easier than confronting what they imply. I remembered everything. I wrote nothing down at first. I let it live in me, sharpen in me, settle into clarity. Revenge fueled by rage is sloppy. Revenge fueled by clarity is surgical. I did not seek to hurt for the sake of hurting. That kind of revenge is temporary. I sought consequence. Consequence lasts. I wanted the truth to land so completely that denial would no longer be possible. I wanted the ground beneath lies to give way slowly, publicly, undeniably. Quiet revenge understands something. Loud revenge never does. The goal is not reaction, it is collapse. I played no role they expected. I showed up composed. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions that sounded harmless but carried weight, questions that forced people to commit to answers. People protect lies by staying vague. Precision terrifies them. Quiet revenge is precise. I let them underestimate me because underestimation creates access. Access creates opportunity. Opportunity creates exposure. They talked freely around me. They contradicted themselves. They grew confident in their version of events, unaware that confidence often precedes error. Quiet revenge thrives on error. There is power in being ignored. Power in being dismissed. Power in being overlooked. When people don't see you as a threat, they reveal themselves. They repeat stories. They adjust details. They forget what they said before. Each change becomes a fracture. Each fracture weakens the structure holding the lie together. Quiet revenge doesn't push. It waits for gravity to do the work. I did not confront immediately. Confrontation alerts. It gives time to prepare defenses. I let time expose the cracks. I let the truth accumulate mass. When it finally moved, it moved with force no one could stop. That is the danger of quiet revenge. By the time it announces itself, it is already finished. They tried to provoke me into mistakes. They wanted emotional reactions they could discredit. I gave them none. Control is the most unsettling response to wrongdoing. It denies perpetrators the narrative they rely on. It denies them the ability to portray themselves as victims of emotion. Quiet revenge robs them of that shelter. I was not cold. I was focused. There is a difference. Focus strips revenge of theatrics and leaves only purpose. My purpose was not humiliation. It was accountability. Accountability does not shout, it documents, it corroborates. It arrives with witnesses and timelines and undeniable alignment. Quiet revenge arrives dressed as truth. What makes quiet revenge the most dangerous is not what it does to the guilty, but what it does to systems that enabled them. It exposes weakness without attacking directly. It forces institutions to confront their own negligence. It leaves no room for excuses. Loud revenge can be dismissed as emotion. Quiet revenge cannot. It is built from facts that refuse to be ignored. They never saw it coming because they were looking for noise. They were watching for explosions. They did not notice the pressure building beneath their feet. Quiet revenge is seismic. It does not destroy everything. It destroys what deserves to fall. And when it finally surfaces, it does not need applause. It does not need validation. It stands on its own, silent, heavy, final. Truth does not need to be sharpened by anger to cut. It arrives already honed clean, precise, unforgiving. Lies require constant protection. Truth requires only exposure. That is why truth is the sharpest weapon. It does not tire, it does not contradict itself, and it does not miss its target. I learned early that truth is not loud by nature. It is often quiet, buried beneath layers of denial and convenience. But once uncovered, it has an edge nothing can dull. People fear truth not because it is violent, but because it is permanent. You can outrun accusations. You cannot outrun facts. Truth does not beg to be believed. It waits, it accumulates, it aligns. It reveals itself through consistency. Every honest detail strengthens it. Every attempt to suppress it sharpens it further. Truth grows more dangerous the longer it is ignored. By the time people are ready to face it, it has already cut through every defense. I did not wield truth recklessly. Reckless truth is dismissed as chaos. I handled it with discipline. I let it mature. I let it connect to other truths. I let it build a structure so solid that, when it was finally presented, it could not be dismantled without collapsing everything around it. Truth is sharp because it exposes contrast. Between what was said and what was done. Between who someone claims to be and who they reveal themselves to be under pressure. Between justice promised and justice delivered. Truth does not attack character, it reveals it. What makes truth so lethal is that it does not need interpretation. It speaks for itself. A timeline does not argue. A pattern does not negotiate. Evidence does not care about intentions. Truth is indifferent to excuses. That indifference is devastating. I watched lies work overtime to survive. They needed coordination. They needed silence. They needed fatigue. Truth needed none of that. It waited patiently, knowing that consistency always outlasts manipulation. Truth has endurance because it is not manufactured. It is discovered. When truth finally enters the room, it changes the temperature. Conversations stop. Certainty dissolves. Authority shifts. People who were confident become cautious. People who were dismissive become defensive. Truth does not threaten, it destabilizes. And destabilization is where accountability begins. Truth is the sharpest weapon because it does not wound randomly. It cuts exactly where it should. It exposes guilt without accusation. It demands response without hostility. It forces systems to either correct themselves or reveal their corruption. There is no safe way to hold truth once it is fully visible. I trusted truth because it could not betray me. People can falter. Institutions can fail. Truth remains intact. It does not change its story. It does not soften under pressure. It does not care who is uncomfortable. That is its power. When I finally released the truth, I did not dramatize it. I presented it. Calmly, completely. I let its sharpness do the work. And it did. It cut through denial. It cut through excuses. It cut through every attempt to minimize what had been done. Truth does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings consequences. And consequences are necessary for healing. Without truth, there is no repair, only avoidance. Truth forces reckoning. Reckoning forces change. That is why truth is the sharpest weapon. It does not need rage to strike. It does not need permission to exist. And once it cuts, nothing ever fits back together the same way again. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay. Because truth survives when we choose to listen, and justice begins when we refuse to forget.